Any questions about projects or anything like that? This is not what we're doing today, but I just had to bring this up. This actually was put up in archive last week by DeepMind. This is a paper on what's called mu0 now. So this is like the next iteration on the alpha zero world of playing games. And because we've been talking about reinforcement learning, I thought this was pretty timely. mu0 is a lot like alpha zero, except for it has there's no notion of how the game is played in the game itself. There's just the ability to make decisions. So there's nothing in the code of this at all that knows anything about any of the games it's played. It learns a model of the game while it's playing, and then from those models, trains a model for the value function, for the policy, and for just basic reward, curve reward for an action. So, anyways, it's far more general, and it's now state of the art on all the Atari games, all of the chess, Go, all these games. These things are typically played. So better than Alpha Zero, better than Alpha Go. So that's pretty cool. Anyways, lots of things happening, right? As we learn these things, lots of progress being made. Okay, so as I mentioned before, what we're going to do today is we're going to watch this lecture here by Gary Marcus. So a couple years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, Gary Marcus had a kind of a debate with Jan LeCun about artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, what it meant. We were going to achieve it with the current methods. And Jan LeCun was taking one side of this, and Gary Marcus taking the other side. And I think Jan LeCun's point of view is often kind of like the point of why we have classes like this. And I thought, so there's a follow-up lecture that Gary Marcus gave that we're going to watch today at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. That is just a really great, lecture on all of Gary's ideas about why, why the current methods may not be getting us to artificial general intelligence. I'm not saying one way or the other that I 100% agree, 100% disagree, but I think it's a really interesting kind of counterpoint to all the things we've been learning. And so I just wanted to watch. We'll watch most of it, not the whole thing, but most of it, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards.
So if I understand this correctly, this is kind of like a counter lecture to.
Yeah.
So what exactly? Can you summarize Jan LeCun's argument in a couple of sentences?
Just reinforcement learning is as we do it now is the way to artificial general intelligence. I mean, that's really very coarse, but that's the idea. So this is now kind of points out that.
Just more data, faster.
More data, more computers. We'll get there. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before we get started? I'm going to sit down with you over there. Hopefully the battery on this will last. Let's see. Make sure you can hear this.
Some of you might know I had a debate with Jan LeCun
Can you hear it?
weeks ago. Some of you might know, in fact, that I'm viewed as an AI contrarian. I'm thinking everyone keeps learning. The field hasn't evolved much. You didn't already know that, you'll know that soon. But I had a debate with Jan LeCun, who is one of the founders of deep learning. And before I had the debate, I made a list of 7 things that I thought we would agree about, and I did a.
By the way, I forgot to mention who Gary Marcus is. You know who Jan LeCun is. Gary Marcus has been a professor of computational psychology for a long time. I think he still holds a post at NYU, I think is what it is. Actually, I'm kind of forgetting right now, but I think it's NYU. He's written lots of interesting books on how the brain works, genetics in the brain, things from this perspective. He got very involved in artificial intelligence a while ago. He founded a company called Geometric Intelligence that was acquired by Uber and became like Uber's AI labs, where there still is, they're employing dozens and dozens of researchers working in various areas. So, anyways, kind of, very like academic, philosophical thinker on things. Maybe not so much an engineer as like, so he was the CEO of this Geometric Intelligence. So more of like, a deep thinker and proponent of his ideas, and he'll actually show some, like, he'll show some of the work that they've done in like in their labs. I guess that's what we were at the time, but anyways, just so you know, just a little bit back over.
Practice talk with my friends before this debate. You can watch the debate on YouTube, by the way.
There's a link
to that. Whether we need more stuff built into AI. I'll talk about that later. But so I made this list. I sent it to Jan. Because my friend said, "Do you know that Jan will really believe all this stuff?" And I said, "I think I have a good model of Jan with professors at NYU, but I'll go check." And Jan wrote back about half an hour later. And he said, "Not only do I agree with all 7 of these, but it's the essence of what I've been arguing in my talks for the last couple of years." So it's good to have a understanding that even though there's a lot that's controversial in AI, I'll certainly say some controversial things, that there are some things that at least some reasonable people who disagree about a lot of things can agree on. So I hope you will all watch that debate, and so you won't just get my perspective on things today, you get his too. But we all agreed that AI is still in its infancy. I'll try to give you some examples of that today. We all agreed that machine learning is fundamentally necessary for reaching strong AI, that deep learning is a powerful technique for machine learning. I think some people think that I think that deep learning isn't a powerful technique, but I do in fact believe that. But both Jan and I also agreed that it's not sufficient on its own for cognition. We're also both pretty down on model-free reinforcement learning, like they do with DeepMind. I'll mention that at least a little bit later. We agreed that AI still needs, or will always need, for a while, better internal forward models, better models of what the world is. And the common sense reasoning remains fundamentally unsolved. Part of the reason I'm here for the next few days is to talk specifically with Lauren about common sense reasoning. To jog that conversation, I'm going to talk about common sense now. But there are people that are much more optimistic than either Jan or myself, like Andrew Ng, who's a very well-known figure in the field. He recently had a Harvard Business Review article, which was kind of trying to tell executives what AI can and can't do. And I very much disagree with the cut on the world that Andrew proposed. He said that AI can now, or at least pretty soon, automate essentially anything that a person can do in a second. And I wish that were true, because I think if that were true, it would mean that strong AI was solved and I could move to the beach. But I think the reality is we're not even close to that. There are some things that humans can do in a second that AI can do really well. So AI now using deep learning to tell the difference between Tiger Woods and a golf ball. It can do that in less than a second. It can probably also distinguish Angelina Jolie. And the dominant paradigm, as I'm sure you all know, and some of you probably participated, is basically taking in big data and forming statistical approximations, usually using the technology that Jan LeCun invented, which is a convolutional neural network, which is an extension of neural networks themselves that are 60 years old. But of course, there's some caveats. So one of the first caveats is you need a huge amount of data, depending on the nature of your problem. You also often need vast amounts of data. And generalization can be very limited. So these kinds of techniques, do I have a pointer here? I don't think that it doesn't work very well. I'll use my finger instead. If you think of some distribution of possible examples, techniques like deep learning, which of course the most popular technique we have right now, are very good on the left hand of the distribution and pretty weak on the right hand of the distribution. I'll give you some examples of that right now. So if you've got a lot of data about Tiger Woods, you might be great. If you have relatively little data about grapefruits, maybe you won't be so good with the grapefruits. And if you think about combinatorial things, where you're looking at combinations of features, like, I don't know, small grapefruits that might actually balance on the top of this glass or something like that, you might not have any data at all, and then deep learning is really of no use. And so you often get bizarre failures. I'll give you an example of one in a second. Here's the kind of thing a person can do in a second, and you might think, hey, deep learning has finally licked this problem. I'll call it the caption problem. So you describe this picture. So you see this picture, and you have to come up with a caption like a group of young people playing a game of Frisbee. And this is data, so to speak, from a Google paper that was described in the New York Times a couple of years ago, I think on the front page. And people thought, we finally solved the caption problem. The source of the breakthrough was that somebody finally had a database of pictures and language descriptions for pictures, and they were able to use that to get some pretty impressive results. So like this one, and how would you describe this one? Well, maybe you'd say it's a person riding a motorcycle on a dirt road, that's what the computer said. And so you get the illusion that deep learning has come close to solving the captioning problem, which would be amazing if we really could solve it. If we really had machines that could look at arbitrary pictures and give descriptions that we humans accept as correct. I think that would itself be a sign of general intelligence. In fact, I've been working on replacing the Turing test, and some people in this room have contributed to the efforts that I'm trying to do. One of the things that I propose as a test is basically comprehension of things like images and videos. And if you just look at some of the examples in these kinds of papers, and there were a lot of them in the last couple of years, you might think that we've made significant progress. But you might look more carefully at some of the errors and realize we actually have a long way to go. So you could look at this as a little bit of an unusual image. You might come up with various kinds of captions, but you probably would not come up with refrigerator filled with lots of food and drinks. If you did, I would refer you to Oliver Sacks, if you were still with us, who wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. This is that kind of error. It's not an optical illusion, as the fans of deep learning like to say. This is more like a hallucination of it's just wrong. I think it's characteristic. And this is a long account problem. I showed you as an example, you're not going to have a lot of parking signs and stickers in your database, and the kinds of systems that are relying on massive data basically get themselves in trouble. There are lots of other problems too, even on the things that I think are most squarely within the domain of what deep learning does well. So you look at this, and you might say a pattern of orange and black stripes, but if your deep learning system trained on the ImageNet database that everybody's trained on, well, pattern of yellow and black stripes isn't an option. You only have the 1,000 categories that are there. And so you say school bus. Again, this is more like hallucination than illusion. Or you could look at this as a person and say, I don't know, a bunch of dots on the square. But if you are trained in a closed world where you have 1,000 choices and you have no way of even articulating other hypotheses, then maybe you would say it's a digital clock. Well, you wouldn't if you were a person, but that's what the deep learning system does. And then perception is much more than simple categorization. So what deep learning does best is categorization, things like ImageNet, so you have these 1,000 categories, or speech recognition, where you have a fixed set of categories. But you could look at this and not only identify the dog, even if you don't have much data of dogs that are upside down doing bench presses. Not only could you identify the dog and the dumbbell, but you could look at it and say things like, I wonder how the dog got so ripped that it could lift this big weight. By the lack of laughing, I feel like you've not had enough coffee. What is going on here? Like, I pilot tested this one. Jeez. All right. We'll see if you laugh at this one, but here's another example of an inference that should tickle your funny bone and is also hard for deep learning. Maybe I need to speak slower, let you look, let you ponder this person's fate at a little greater length. I took out at least half of my Trump jokes, so. All right. So this is a problem of inference, right? It's not just that you want to categorize that there's either a parachute or a backpack. You want to figure out what's happening next. We don't have AI systems that do that at all. You can do that in a second, Andrew Wagner's just wrong. He thinks that your machine can do anything. So here's Andrew's actual quote. If a typical person can do a mental task with less than 1 second of thought, we can probably automate it using AI either now or in the near future. And here's my emendation to his quote that I think is closer to the mark of where we actually are. And I'm mostly talking about kind of the large part of the field that right now is doing things like image recognition with deep learning. I realize you guys are doing something closer. That, if I ever come anywhere where I'm preaching with Converge, it's probably this audience. So I'm kind of talking about a broader trend of the field. But so if a typical person can do a mental task with less than 1 second thought, and we can gather an enormous amount of directly relevant data, which is something Andrew leaves out, we have a fighting chance, so long as the test data aren't too terribly different from the training data, and the domain doesn't change too much over time. So you think about the most impressive demonstrations of AI lately, things like AlphaGo Zero, which I'll talk about a little bit. These are domains where you get an enormous amount of directly relevant data because you can simulate things perfectly, and you can kind of span the space of possible situations that you might encounter. And so the test data aren't too terribly different from the training data, and the domain hasn't changed in 2,500 years since they invented the rules of Go. This is not necessarily characteristic of a lot of the domains that people might actually want to work on. So there are things where people have made a lot of progress in AI lately, and I have some of them in green here. For example, speech recognition, especially in quiet rooms with native speakers asking search queries. We are pretty good at image recognition in bounded worlds with limited numbers of objects. We're pretty good at natural language understanding in very narrowly bounded domains like movie times and sports scores. And we're really good at advertising targeting, which is like 70% of the research in AI. So we're kind of good at that. There are lots of things that we're still pretty poor at. So we still don't have anything like open-ended conversational interfaces. I would say, don't have anything like automated scientific discovery, though if anybody is working on something relevant to that, it's probably in this room. Automated medical diagnosis, I think, is still a long way away. You may know about Watson and won at Jeopardy, and the original plan was to make it do automated medical diagnosis. And you can look up what happened at MD Anderson, the cancer center there, when IBM tried to apply Watson medical diagnosis. People are talking about doing automated scene comprehension for blind people, but what they really have is things that will like label the most prominent object in a room. So I could go around this room and it might tell me camera or person, but that's not telling me that there's a group of people listening to a lecture, possibly falling asleep, etc. Domestic robots is something we would like to have, or elder care robots. We're not anywhere close to doing that. And one could wonder how close we are to safe and reliable driverless cars. So we can build driverless cars that go on limited routes and so forth, but whether they're safe or reliable, whether they can go without detailed maps and, in places like New York City is a way open question. So the way I think about it is, as a cognitive scientist, is there are many things that go at least into natural cognition. My perspective on artificial intelligence comes from natural intelligence, which is where I spent most of my career. And I would say that there are lots of things that go into natural intelligence. There's language, there's perception, there's planning, and so forth, reasoning. And really, all the fuss lately has been about progress on perception. There's been almost no progress on the rest of the pie chart. My biggest fear about AI is not the Terminator and Skynet, which is, of course, what gets all the attention right now, but it's actually getting stuck. So, the dominant metaphor, and it's not even a metaphor, the dominant intellectual tool at some level in machine learning is the idea of local minima and avoiding local minima. I'm afraid that AI is heading towards a local minima. And I'll add something about that in a second. So the idea is we want to be climbing down some mountain, and we take small incremental steps, and we get to something that's the bottom of one valley, but it's not really the bottom of the mountain. That's my biggest worry about AI, is that we're going to get stuck. Which would be a shame. If we never got past the local minimum, we might never, even if we could be great at targeting advertising, there's a lot of money to be made from AI right now. We might never build machines that can actually read, that can discover cures for cancer, that understand how the brain works. We can build domestic robots and so forth. So I actually made this graph about a year ago, talking about gradient descent through model space. So you can think of what deep learning does is it does gradient descent through a space of possible models that do object recognition. But the field is kind of doing gradient descent through a set of models and algorithms and so forth to do things like object recognition. And it's made very steady progress. So people could not do object recognition worth beans in 1980. And they got better and they got better. There were big advances in 2012. 2017 hasn't actually seen a lot of big advances. I've been talking to people lately, like, what's the big advance in deep learning this year? And there hasn't really been one. The hidden capsule networks, for example, is an interesting paper, but most people would say it's early. It's not clear what it shows. It's possible they're actually getting close to that local minimum. Hinton himself, well, I guess I have to quote later, but it is backing off from the kind of stuff we're doing. So my biggest fear is this, that we're going to get the local minimum. And we are making this kind of gradual progress in speech recognition, object recognition, language translation. But there are some other problems where it's not that we're getting anywhere near to genuine improvement. So natural language understanding, I would say we've not made real progress since ELIZA in 1965, which used template. We've made some progress, but I would say that fundamentally we still don't understand how to do it. The systems that are kind of dominant right now, in terms of like the deep learning tradition, are very easily fooled. I should have had a quote up here, or should have put in a slide here, especially for this crowd, from Person Yang stuff. Has anybody seen this from this year with the distractor words? So at least some of you know this. So it sort of looks right, and then you put in a couple of irrelevant words in the embedded clause, and the whole system basically falls apart. So it's not clear that the kind of progress that we're making as we march down towards minimizing error on particular data sets is really getting us where we want to go. The fundamental risk, of course, is that we might spend an enormous amount of time on a particular task going to hit a wall. And if you're just doing license plate recognition and you get really good at it but not perfect, maybe that's fine. But there are other domains where the cost of being less than perfectly accurate is pretty high. So if you have a recommendation engine that asymptotes at 2.5% correct because you went down the wrong path and you hit a local minimum, nobody cares. I mean, if I'm recommending songs to you, and 39 out of 40 of the songs are songs you like, and I could have, if I had done a better job of giving you a recording song, I can just say, I was giving you something new to see if you liked it. Right, so it's not a big deal. But if I'm building a pedestrian detector and it's 97.5% correct in my driverless car, and I put out a fleet of 1 million driverless cars, this is mayhem. It would be the end of the driverless car program. Probably not for better, actually, for worse, but we would actually like to have driverless cars to save people's lives. But if what happens is on a particular day, a particular aggressive manufacturer rolls something out in a lot of cars, a lot of people die. In trouble. Same thing with domestic robots. So if I have a domestic robot that picks up grandpa and puts him in his bed 39 times out of 40 correctly and drops him on the 40th time, I do not have a viable solution. So why aren't we there yet? Why have we not gotten to strong AI? In the 60s, when people like Minsky and McCarthy, for whom 1/3 of this room is named, were working on strong AI, they had excuses that they could readily supply. They could say, we don't have a lot of memory here. Our computers are slow, especially if they could have imagined ahead into the future and realized that some guy would have a watch on his hand that had much more power than any of those guys had to work with. So in the 60s, we were very bounded by compute, by memory, and so forth. But 60 years later, we're not so bounded by those things. Google wants to run, put teraflops on plain Go, they more or less can, or at least they're pretty close to being able to do that. And yet, 60 years later, a lot of very smart people have thought about this puzzle. We're not really there yet. So what are some impediments to reaching strong AI? One is, as I said in the beginning, this maybe be on the slide, I think we all agree that machine learning has to be part of the answer. You cannot hard code all of the knowledge that you need about the world in order to do strong AI. So that means you have to use machine learning. Might not be the machine learning that we're using now. Maybe we're doing machine learning in totally the wrong way. But engineering machine learning is hard. It's a very different thing than classical programming. So in classical programming, you can build small modules. You can prove to your own satisfaction anyway that they work. In certain cases, you can just prove that they work. And then you put those together into larger systems and larger systems and so forth. At least the way that machine learning is being practiced right now, we don't have, and then you can go and debug them. So you can revise them incrementally. You can say, I want this module to do something slightly different, but you can know what the consequences are going to be for other systems. When people do what they call end-to-end deep learning, as they're often doing now, which is like your input is pixels and your output is an action for an Atari game system or something like that, there's no way to do the same kind of incremental debugging. If you're in a small limited domain like Atari games, maybe that's okay. But if you want to build larger systems and kind of use your AI as services, as people talk about it now in industry, we don't know how to make those services work reliably. Peter Norvig gave a great talk in MTech 2 years ago, which I urge you all to see, where he talked about some of these problems. And one of the examples he gave is like, what you really do is you find out empirically does something work. And it's only that it works with respect to some data sets. You don't have a formal proof that it works in general. So it works on Tuesdays and you test it on Thursdays, as an example, and great, it seems terrific. And then you test it on Thanksgiving and it's different. Like you don't have a prior way to know that except to actually test it on Thanksgiving. And so it's also very difficult to verify that these systems work. So the consequence is a huge amount of technical debt. So D. Scully is at Google, turned out to be the nephew of John Scully, who ran Apple for a little while. Has this paper called Machine Learning, the High Interest Credit Card of Technical Debt. The point is, you can fairly quickly, especially if you're good at linear algebra, come up with a solution that works reasonably well for any given problem, often by making a lot of dodgy assumptions. Dodgy assumptions about distributions of data sets and what they're going to be like as problems scale up and so forth. And so you make a proof of concept, but you don't know what part of your system is actually responsible for why things work. You don't know what's going to happen if you change it. So DeepMind built their Atari game system, and it played Breakout really well. Vicarious has some cool demos. I'll show you a similar one from my own company. Vicarious has some cool demos where they change the intensity of the pixels, and suddenly the DeepMind Atari game system can't play Breakout anymore, right? So there's no formal proof that the system is going to work if you vary the problem from the test set that it was trained on, or the training set that it was trained on, to a new set. Like, you want your system to be guaranteed to work even if you change the lighting intensity. You know, the human brain, up to some limits, is pretty good at recognizing the same situation. If I flipped out the lights, I'd still understand that you guys are all here and still be able to have the same kinds of interactions with you and so forth. That's not true of the DeepMind system. So there's this great cartoon that SKCD ran a couple of weeks ago. So one guy says to the other, this is your machine learning system. Yep, you pour the data into this big pile of linear algebra, and you collect the answers on the other side. The other guy says, well, what happens if your answers are wrong? And he says, well, you just stir the pile until it starts looking right. That is what happens empirically in the deep learning world right now. People do things like, I'll add another resident layer, or I'll add another ComNet, or I'll change the stride length. And some people are really good at that stirring, like Ilias Skever, who runs OpenAI, I think is a genius at figuring out how to stir the linear algebra for a particular problem set. But this is not a methodology, I think, that is getting us the strong answer. It doesn't give us robust, verifiable solutions that we can use in the context of building larger systems. Okay, so the second issue is that statistics is not the same thing as knowledge. So there are lots of cases where knowing a statistical regularity gives you knowledge, but there's lots of knowledge where you don't really have the statistics and you still can reason about things pretty well. A lot of that is what I would call common sense. I don't want to say all of it or most of it, but a certain subset. So I have a review with Ernie Davis on common sense reasoning in AI that ran in the Communications to ACM about 2 years ago. What did you describe it? Warren recently reread the paper. He said it was something like totally brilliant and completely depressing, or something to that effect, or fantastic and depressing. So the cover of the issue, we didn't do the art, Ernie Davis and I, but we inspired to get the art. I'm not sure that's a compliment, but we inspired the art. So it is a robot sitting on a tree limb, and the robot is about to take a chainsaw and cut that tree limb, which, of course, as they say in Ghostbusters, would be bad. You don't want to learn this fact about tree limbs, which side of the tree limb you should be on, by having 10,000 trials, right? You don't want to fall and have a distribution of people underneath you on someone who died. Right? It's not a good way to do it. It's not even a good way to think about the problem. This is not the kind of knowledge that you should acquire by trial and error, or by reinforcement learning, by having robots move the chainsaw a little bit each time and seeing which version causes the least harm to the pedestrians underneath and so forth. This is the wrong paradigm. So I want to give you and just stoke Warren for the conversation we're going to have. So just like a basic example or two of common sense. So here's one. Can a spider get out of this jar? So if it's a sealed jar of a particular shape, and I tell you, I'll even just assert it. I'll say, the spider in here can't get out of the jar, right? And now I want to know, how general is your understanding of that? And so I show you other jars. And if you're a human being, you can make some pretty good guesses that the spider's probably not going to get out of these jars either. I mean, I could be playing games, we talk about games. I could be playing in terms of there could be a little secret hole in the back of it. But you can make the inference that under ordinary circumstances, the spider's not going to get out of those jars, but the spider, it would be easier if the light jar. You can probably tell it's a broken jar. And so, if it's a broken jar, the spider can probably get out. You may have never done that science fair experiment. And some of you may have played with ants when you were a kid, and so you've got a little relevant data. A lot of you have no real direct experience on broken jars and spiders climbing out, but you can make the inference perfectly well. This is completely lacking, I would say, in most of what we've got in AI right now. Another example, broken jar, you can tell that the spider's going to get out, it can be of any shape. Here's another example kind of in the same vein. So I discovered the other day, preparing a version of this talk, this thing, I've forgotten the name of it already, but it's something like a yarn feeder or something like that. So I looked at one yarn feeder, and then I did a Google search for more, and they can look really pretty different. So it's not an association, a direct association from all this entry. It's not the one that I ordered, mind you. Once you get the concept, you can say, oh, here's a whole bunch of them. And you can figure out like what it's for and recognize arbitrarily large numbers of them. So that's what I think about common sense reasoning. What common sense reasoning is. The field isn't even trying to do this. So Oren, I know, is not a fan of Douglas and Psych, but Oren knows what Douglas and Psych is. We've had conversations about this. Show of hands here. How many people here know what Douglas and Psych is? Even here, it's not that many people. I think this is a problem in the educational system of the field. So Douglas and Psych system, for those who don't know it, was a concerted effort to make a computable version of common sense knowledge. It was started in the 1980s. It continues today. It's probably something like 1,200 person years of effort. I would agree with Oren. I think that it was not successful. It's not been turned into any major commercial product. It's still incomplete in terms of the knowledge, despite all of that effort. But it was, I think, the most concerted effort to say, can we encode common sense knowledge in a form that machines could compute over it? And even in this room, which is probably more sympathetic to that kind of thing than the average room in AI, most of you haven't heard it. When I spoke about, or when I asked the same question at NIPS when I was on a panel with an audience of 800, I got about the same number of raised hands as here, same absolute number that is raised here, which is saying not that many people know what the problem is. And my view is that Lenin was trying to solve the right problem, which is if you want to be able to do things like read open-ended text or look at images in open-ended ways, you need to know how the world works. And you need to have that represented somewhere. And yet, as far as I can tell, nobody in AI is even really accepting it. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of problems with it. So, another problem is they did what they did in isolation. It wasn't a project that involved the community. It was, even from what I understand within the confines of Psych, it was mostly kind of a very top-down driven project, in which maybe other people who didn't think it should be done the same way didn't maybe have that much voice. So there are lots of reasons why I think it failed. I was giving the lack of commercial results as one index of the lack of publication is I think both symptom and cause. So I didn't mean to say those are the only issues, but that was just an example. Nonetheless, I think what Lenin was trying to do. All right. So here's another issue, and I think they're actually related. The standard bias in the field is to assume that virtually everything in the that you need to know is learned. That you need to start essentially with a blank slate. There's a huge bias. This is what the debate LeCun was about in part. So LeCun will look at the world and he'll see that something's broken, right? There are people like Andrew Ng. There's got to be like a joke in this somewhere. Work on this afterwards. But so you show Andrew a broken light bulb and he says it works. I think this is how the joke goes. You show Jan LeCun a broken light bulb, and what he says is you just need to learn how the light bulb should work. And what I say is it would help if you knew something in advance about what a light bulb is supposed to do. So most of the field doesn't do it that. Most of the field says, I'm going to learn it all from data. And I'll fix it. We're going to do the orange version afterwards. So I think if you look at the cognitive development literature, which is really where I was trained, the language acquisition literature, there are tons of reasons to think that in biology there's lots of stuff that's in it. So Pinker's book, Language Instinct, which I hope everybody here will read eventually, if you haven't already read it, lays out some arguments for why we might think that language is innate. How are we doing on time? I don't know. But the number one argument is really the poverty of the stimulus argument. This is really Chomsky's argument. The thinker explains it very well in the book. Language and instinct. And the argument there is essentially there's an infinite number of sentences we can understand and generate and so forth. We get relatively limited data. And if you think about what I was saying about deep learning, it's actually a form of the same argument. So deep learning interpolates very well between known examples and extrapolates abysmally once it gets out of the space of examples that we've seen before. And I laid that argument out, I think, particularly crisply in my book, The Algebraic Mind, in 2001. I think that fundamentally still is the case. And more generally, you get back away from the details of deep learning. Most learning algorithms, if they start with no constraint and they're faced with potential infinities, are going to have trouble. There's something by, I get my Walports confused, David Walport, called the no free lunch theorem, which basically says all algorithms have bias, and starting with the bias that like any particular version of language is equally possible, probably wrong. Then there's like the robustness with which kids learn language across lots of different environments. You can talk to them directly or not. So some cultures think that the way that we talk to our kids in like in Manhattan and give them lots of feedback or whatever is silly. It's like talking to a plant. Like, they don't talk to their kids as directly, but the kids learn language in those cultures too. So there's a robustness to the system that you don't see again in a deep learning system. It's like a lot of the work in deep learning right now is on something called like curriculum design, or I forget the exact term, but it's like, well, we're going to figure out how to sequence the training data to the system so the system gets the result that we want. And human kids don't require that. I mean, there's a little bit of it that we optionally do, but they can learn from they get to the same place from very different input signals. And there's lots of experimental work. Yes.
Seems like they do require. I mean, you can't talk in using adult language to a 2-year-old child, right?
Well, there's actually anthropological data that says that you can. We don't do it in, at least I don't do it necessarily in my family, but I come closer to talking to my kids like adults than a lot of people do. And my father certainly talked to me like I was an adult when I was little, and make whatever extrapolations you want from that. But there is anthropological data looking at societies where they just don't talk to kids. Like I said, they think that's like talking to a plant. Why are you doing that? And yet the kids manage to learn. And they partly learn by talking and interacting with their siblings and so forth. But the regimes are very different, and there's a substantial literature on cross-cultural variation that makes me comfortable in saying that. That there can be pretty substantial differences in how, what the nature of input. So like, motherese is allegedly cross-culturally universal, but the data on that are not so strong, and there's lots of kids that don't get that much of it, but they get there. There's also data, there's been studies for years, I've just given you the most recent, that show that younger and younger kids are able to understand different things about the world. This is one that just came out in Current Biology a couple months ago. And it shows that kids distinguish between the top picture A and the bottom picture C in the womb. And B and D are showing how that might look inside the womb because they're using lights from the outside and the light diffuses. But the point is that pre-newborns are able to distinguish between faces and inverted faces. That looks a lot like it. Yeah.
How does the conflict you just said was one that I'm like, kids are trying to they sort of lose the ability to understand personalities, generate sentences?
So that's, I mean, hold that in your head for a second. Let me get to a summary slide. About 3 slides. Looking at the biological evidence, there's an astonishing amount of brain organization, even independently, even internally generated experience. So there's a great insufficiently cited study in Science where they built a knockout mouse that basically couldn't learn anything because they turned off synaptic transmission, and then they looked at birth, and the knockout mouse is essentially in its brain structures as they could measure 15 years ago, indistinguishable from a mouse that could do some internal learning. So there's a lot. I'm not saying everything is permanently wired at birth. That relates to my answer to you. What I'm saying is there is a lot of pre-wiring of the brain, which is what I think innate structure amounts to. Most of your genome is expressed in your brain. A lot of it's expressed in very specific ways, and a lot of the best data come down the street from the Allen Brain Institute. They're going to have a new paper, I think, in a couple of weeks that I think makes this overwhelmingly clear. And there are a lot of mechanisms in evolution in terms of things like duplicating genes and stuff like that. I wrote a lot about this in my book, The Birth of the Mind. And there's more and more evidence that part of what evolution has done is to refine the initial structure of the brain. This goes back to your question. The way I see it and wrote about the birth of the mind is pre-wiring doesn't include rewiring. A lot of times when people have the nature-nurture thing, they're like nature versus nurture. But it's really like nature allows nurture. Rewiring the brain is just a particular set of biological and genetically driven mechanisms that allow you to adapt things in certain kinds of circumstances. Just like we have mechanisms for recovering from scrapes on our knees. These are innate mechanisms that allow change in response to the environment. But there's a lot of stuff, I don't know if I need to go through a whole slide, showing that John Locke was wrong. We aren't born as blank slates. Now that's biology. It could be different for AI. But I think biology is just overwhelming. But then you go back to someone like Young and Kuhn, and they don't even put on the table the possibility that you could have a name structure in your AI system. So Kuhn and I agree about like common sense is really hard. Kids are much better at it than machines. And then he says, well, what does that mean? That means there must be some learning paradigm that we haven't figured out. Well, that's possible, certainly possible. It's probably even partly true. But the other possibility is that there's an innate structure too that we're missing. Although, I guess my slides are slightly out of order. The usual presumption is what we need to do is to fix the learning paradigm. In the space of design choices, innate machinery generally gets ignored altogether. In fact, when Dave Chalmers and Ned Block and Jan LeCun and I were negotiating what the debate was going to be about, there was some discussion about maybe we should talk about AI and nativism. And Chalmers' first idea was maybe we should debate about that because he did a Google search for nativism and AI and got a did you mean that error message? Like, so few people even think about this question. There's nothing that's been written about in the last 15 years. I think this is because of a bias. I would call that bias physics envy. That people like LeCun want the answer to AI, or sometimes the answer to neuroscience, to be something like 4 equations you can put on a t-shirt, because that's what works in physics. But I don't see any reason to think that has to be the case for AI. So possibilities for reaching next level AI, one is we need better learning algorithms. That's what Kuhn thinks. I think that's part of the answer, but we probably also need more machinery constraining what those algorithms learn. So that's kind of possibility C, and I think it's very rarely studied in the context of ML. I think common sense reasoning has to start by having at least a little bit of element B and not just tweaks in the linear algebra for element A. Everybody knows AlphaGo, and probably AlphaGo 0, and the astonishing learning that DeepMind has managed to do with Go. This is the less astonishing learning done when they try to learn language. So they have a artificial world, you can walk around it, and it has to do things like find the green cone, or whatever. And it's the same group of authors like Gemma Hassovitz who are on the Go stuff, and they've got a model that's the convolutional network combined with an LSTM, all the kind of stuff you expect these guys to do. And over time, it learns a bunch of stuff. We don't need to go into the details, but eventually, it learns the training set, and oh wow, isn't that great? But if you look at the axis down here, it's like it's taking you a million training trials to learn a couple of words. If you know the developmental psychology literature, that is pitiful. Kids can actually learn meanings of new words, or at least something about the meanings of new words, in like 1 or 2 trials. So it's grossly inefficient compared to what is theoretically possible. And they didn't even put in the paper, but somebody from the lab gave a talk in my uni recently. So I discovered what happens if you try something like stay away from the brain. So now you have negation. Instead of just learning correlations between features, you have to learn correlations at a more abstract level, one way to think about it. The data was so bad they didn't put it in the paper. So the system simply could not learn. I took a picture of my cell phone to get it because it wasn't in the paper. That's why I told the story. The system isn't anywhere near that. So you have problems like Go, where you have all this data, you can simulate things in perfect fidelity, and you get reasonable performance. And then you have problems like language, where it's not just correlations of features, and it's just not as good. Nobody ever believes me about nativism. They don't want to think that human beings have innate structure, but for some reason they don't mind when I show this video, which I'll show you, which is a baby ibex climbing down a mountain. So the baby ibex cannot do reinforcement learning. It can do reinforcement learning to fine-tune a little bit, but the cost of error is death, right? And so over evolutionary time, the baby ibex's brain has been tuned to know something about how to climb these mountains. And it does it pretty amazingly well, but it doesn't make a lot of mistakes. It's not an RL system. In fairness, I don't have the music here, but what happens when we take our current AI and robots. All the things, you may have seen this blooper reel last year from the DARPA competition. All of the tasks that are here are actually tasks that were tested in simulation. But the real world is not identical to simulation. They use the robot operating system. They do simulation, they train it on tasks like opening doorknobs, and then you put them in the real world. They don't work so well. All right. I think for the first time in my career, I find myself in agreement with Jeff Hinton. We both think we need to start over. He gave this very interesting interview to Axios a couple weeks ago, about a month ago, in a conference in Toronto. He actually said maybe we need to give up on back propagation, which is the thing for which he is famous, and the local minimum I think that the field is stuck on. What he thinks we need to do next is unsupervised learning. That'll be the last part of what I talk about before returning questions. So both Hinton and LeCun, who are two of the biggest figures in machine learning, and hence right now in AI, because that's the popular part right now, they both point to unsupervised learning. Well, what is unsupervised learning? There is two kinds that I think are in the literature, and then there's a kind I think we should actually think about. So the one kind is what people call cluster analysis. So the Google Cat Detector is the most famous version of this. The Google Cat Detector watched a lot of YouTube videos, and they did single cell psychophysics like a neuroscientist would do on the model, and they found a neuron that looked like it was recognizing cats, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. This is in 2012. That model is no longer in production. They couldn't get it to do anything useful, but it got a lot of press. This is a kind of unsupervised learning. You see a bunch of these pictures, not labeled at all, and you try to figure out, is there some like natural classes here of these things that I've seen. I don't mean to speak ill of it. I think this is a necessary technique probably in the grand scheme of AI. Then there's another version that LeCun is talking about. We don't have to read all the text, but which is basically like I watch a bunch of frames of a video and I try to build to predict the next frame. So it's a very clever idea. Instead of having a teacher like paying a bunch of people on Amazon for $2 an hour in order to figure out how the world works, you just take videos, and videos have temporal continuity, right? So what happens in frames 1, 2, and 3 typically predict what happens in frame 4. It's not 100% of the time, but generally they're pretty predictive. So here's a pretty easy case, right? Somebody is pedaling, and you can guess where their feet should be next. And so LeCun is trying to pursue that approach to unsupervised learning. He's trying to predict what happens in a video. Often it doesn't work that well, partly because there are many options. So if you're looking at highway traffic, you can predict frames, but you don't want to predict the average of the frames that you see. You really want to predict distributions in some fairly abstract way. So you don't want to take the average of the people who go straight, the people who go left, and the people who go right. You can take the exit ramp, move over a lane, and keep going forward. If I just take the average of that, I just get a blur. So a big challenge in this field has been to how to not get a blur, how to represent the kind of range of logical possibilities without blending in between. That's a problem those guys have to solve. I can talk about it, but that's not what I think we should think about when we think about unsupervised learning. Part of the reason is, in the words of my friend Eric Simoncelli, who I think is the only computational neuroscientist who won an Emmy Award, he said, you can't model the probability distribution function for the whole world because the whole world is too complicated. This is what I think LeCun is mistakenly getting himself into, is trying to predict the entire world, and it's just too much there. Okay. I think what's going to happen, before I get to my own to this out of order, what's going to happen is the same thing that I think has happened to deep reinforcement learning. So in deep reinforcement learning, you have the illusion that you've gotten somewhere, but you don't really, because you bound the world. As soon as you move the world a little bit, it's different. I mentioned the breakout thing before. Here's something my own company, Geometric Intelligence, did. We trained DQN from DeepMind on this particular game over there, 3D game where you have to basically like fly your plane through towers, and given enough data, the algorithm can learn. It can learn any fixed set of situations. But now we move the obstacles around, and it just flies right into them because it hasn't really abstracted the notion of safe space or occluders or collision or anything like that. It's just memorized contingencies between pixels. I think what's going to happen to unsupervised learning literature, if people insist on doing it straight from pixels, is exactly what's happened to DQN. DQN doesn't really work. DQN DeepMind got a lot of press out of it because it played a lot of targets, but they never tested could it transfer its knowledge even to different levels on a video game. Okay, so this is my daughter Chloe, and we were in Vancouver in the summer. I'm sitting at Whole Foods. This is a reenactment, I should say. I didn't get the first time through, but she sat in this chair and she looked at this aperture and she thought, I wonder if I can get through this. This is unsupervised learning. It's like, nobody's telling me to do this. I'm not going to try it 10 minutes. That's boring. But I'm going to try it and see if I can do it using the knowledge that I have about the world. So she was able to replicate for me. What happened the first time is she kind of looked at it and she figured out a way through, and then she got a little bit stuck and she did some problem solving to figure out how to get her arm through, and eventually she succeeded. That's unsupervised learning, right? It's not 50,000 trials of reinforcement learning and getting injured, which her father would not allow her to do, and so forth. It's, I see a problem, I understand the limits of some system, and I want to push that system harder. Unsupervised learning, as it's currently practiced, is nothing like what Chloe is doing. So there's like unsupervised learning as a trade name for a particular set of techniques. I don't think that's getting us anywhere. The broader thing of how do you get systems to explore spaces they haven't explored before, I think is very interesting. How am I doing on time? I have a little thing about innateness, and I don't know how much time you want me to allow, because I know there's like a discussion after. I'll do this in a minute or two. Lots of models already have innateness, but it's not very principled. So here's AlphaGo, not AlphaGo 0, but the original AlphaGo paper from a year ago. And to some extent, you look at it and you say, well, that's just a neural network, and Dennis will tell you, we don't have any handcrafted rules, and people get all excited about it. And then you look in the back of the paper, and there are all these things that are actually innate in the system, like how many spaces a system can go, a player can go at a particular point. Well, they definitely did better this year. I should say, it was also Monte Carlo tree search built in, which is something that's been critical in computer Go for 15 years. So there are lots of ways in which, even if you don't believe in innate knowledge, you still build in if you're a neural network kind of person. So you make choices about how many layers that do I want, what types of layers, what should the input units stand for, what should the activity function be, etc., etc. So then they just released this paper, which has made me more angry than any paper that I've read in the last 15 years, in which they say mastering the Go, game on Go, and then the part that makes me angry is without human knowledge. And this is just a false claim. You can see it again in the abstract. So they say, what we have done here, the media has believed it completely, is we have a new algorithm that can learn anything. You don't need to teach it anything about the domain that you're using. Nobody seems to have noticed that of these 17 authors, 10 of them were authors on the last paper, which built the last world champion Go. One of them, if I can find where he is, hiding here, is in fact a Go champion. So they had a lot of human expertise here, despite the title. And somehow nobody in the review process called on that. But it turns out they actually built in lots of stuff that's very relevant for Go. So it starts with Monte Carlo tree search is built in. It would have been truly amazing if they had a reinforcement learning algorithm of some general nature, and it had induced Monte Carlo tree search in just the form that they used. But that's not what actually happened. They started with Monte Carlo tree search, which anybody who has ever worked on computer Go in the last 15 years would tell you was a fundamental component. They actually wired that in. Then they did other things, like they noticed that the Go board is invariant across reflection, rotation, and so forth, as a good mathematician would tell you. And so they built in data augmentation to deal with that problem. And they built in specific, special, customized sampling in their Monte Carlo tree search thing in order to deal with that. And they built in transformational invariance in the form of convolution in just the places that they needed. So you look at the architecture, they have it in 19 places and not the other 20 places. They built in parameters like what the stride length or the convolution would be that are suited to a Go board of that size but may not be suited to a Go board of another size. And then they gave zero evidence, literally zero evidence, that the system could actually be used unaltered on any other problem. So the heart of the claim is we don't need any human knowledge. We have a universal solver, but they didn't give any data for that. How that got through peer review, I don't know. What I think we need to do is actually to think about innateness, but in a more principled way. So here's one way to think about it. This is from Liz Felke, one of the world's great developmental psychologists now at Harvard. Cornell, when she wrote this. She said, children are endowed innately with abilities to perceive objects, persons, sets, and places. Then they can use their perceptual experience to learn about the properties of such entities. It's far from clear how children could learn anything about the entities in the domain. However, they could not signal out those entities in their surroundings. So she's both making a positive claim about what some innate knowledge might be for humans and animals, not for AI, which wasn't on her mind. But she's making a positive proposal about some of the stuff that might need to be innate, and also making what people in the language field would call a learnability argument, saying, if you don't start with at least that, then you're in trouble. I made related kinds of arguments in different domains in the book, The Algebraic Mind. I was talking more about computational prerequisites. You can think of like, is the brain a little bit like a microprocessor? What are the basic instructions you need? So you need, for example, to have operations over variables. So in the debate I had with Kuhn, I made a list of 10 proposals. I said, these are things you have to have innate in your system if you have any hope of getting something like human level cognition out of your system. Only one of them is typically embedded in neural networks today, which is transplantation invariance, which is actually the technique that LeCun himself invented, convolution. The others mostly are not, and mostly willfully, I would say, are not. And people don't want to explore the space with the rest of them. And the crucial point of the debate, David Chalmers asked LeCun, how many of those 10 would you build in? And LeCun actually said 0. And I said, well, not even translational invariance? I mean, that's what you're famous for, is convolution. He said, nah, we have enough data, we don't need it. So there was a real debate there in the end of the day, which is, do we need stuff like this? And I would say, when we've tried to get away without it, we really haven't gotten very far. This is a diagram from a paper that Ernie Davis and I have. He made the diagram. I didn't have that much to do with it, except he could tell me to do it. But I'm drawing on the paper. This was looking at just one little problem, which is understanding relationships about containers. And in order to get this to work right, he built in knowledge about things like time, space, objects, history of where things have been, actions, and so forth. I don't expect anybody to particularly accept these particular details, and I'm not going to run through them right now because we're going to talk. But I don't think it's an accident that what Ernie needed in order to get the containers to work right is essentially the same stuff that Spelke and I independently have been talking about for a while. I think we need to think about things at this level. What is the knowledge you need to represent time and space and objects? I mean, this goes back even further, right, to Kant and Critique of Pure Reason. Kant made, I think, the first modern nativist argument. And that's the things that he pointed to. I think we need to start thinking about how you get those into a system along with the power of machine learning to learn from data. But don't learn these things too. If you don't start with those things, then you're at pixels and you just don't get far enough. I wrote this in the New Yorker 5 years ago. And some people would think I was totally wrong, but I think if you read carefully, you realize it's not. So I said then, deep learning suddenly got popular. I said, okay, that's great, but realistically, deep learning is only part of the larger challenge of building intelligent machines. I argued in particular, I didn't say deep learning would make no progress, but I said that such techniques lack ways of representing causal relationships, are likely to face challenges in acquiring abstract ideas. They have no obvious ways of performing logical inferences. They're still a long way from integrating abstract knowledge. I would say 5 years later, there's been no progress on the things that I signaled out as being ineffective. So to finish up and then take questions, and I think we have an after session for at least some people. Machine learning is great. I don't mean to tell people to stop doing it, but deep reinforcement learning, which is the popular stuff that's in the news all the time, purely from pixels, it's just not actually getting us closer to artificial general intelligence. Anybody who thinks that is true is not looking at all of these tests of transfer and things like that. We also need knowledge in our systems, knowledge about things like space and time and objects and so forth. And strong starting points like I guess it's kind of said the same thing, but rich initial representations of time, space, action, objects, etc. Then maybe we can begin. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, reactions, thoughts, anything that made you think about?
So I don't understand what the difference between unsupervised learning is and deep reinforcement learning, given what he said up there.
Okay, so he was using it. So in this talk, when you talk about unsupervised learning, I think he talked about it in a pretty standard way, which is, there are ways of representing the stimuli or the data that you have that sort of pull out the that represent the essence of what this is.
clustering.
Well, and clustering is a downstream product of what comes out of this. So like if you have good representations, then then they do cluster, right? So if these representations are vectors, this is how we often think about this problem. If they're vectors, then like all the things of a similar class sort of cluster together, because you have you represented the essence of what that thing is. So like if these are images, but there's So I think that's that's a common understanding of what unsupervised learning is, and like how I think he was referring to it here. And he's Gary thinks I think he says something like it's probably a necessary component of like a general AI system, or an artificial general intelligence. But certainly not sufficient. But then the deep RL, like his point was, essentially all that's being learned is what he would call contingencies between pixels, right? So like I think like the most compelling example is this, video game of the airplane, right? And it plays a lot of these games. It's reinforced, and then all of a sudden it like learns to fly perfectly between the pillars. But then he said we just changed the game slightly. We moved the pillars closer together. The plane could still fit through it. There was still a way to solve this, but more than half of the obstacles were ran into. And the point he's making there is that like this didn't learn that it didn't learn that like that was a pillar, and that the pillar, it's like running into the pillars is bad. What it learned was, like when these pixels of these colors are like this, like this far away or whatever. This is, and I'm here. I need to make a left hand turn or make a right hand turn. So, I mean, you could maybe argue that there's like some understanding of like pillar, but because it's looking at this pixel, but really all it's got is like some understanding about like the pixels represent itself and pixels that represent the pillar, and that when those get into a certain relationship, then I need to make this kind of move sort of here. That's a in his mind this is like a really different way of like thinking about understanding than say like we all think of how we like all of us would tackle this problem, or how we all kind of describe the problem. We would have no problem walking through these these pillars or playing this video game, because we like immediately grasp that one of the pillars are far apart, close together. The point is that there's like space in between that we need to get through, and that that the RL systems are not very.
So like the unsupervised system would be basically like learning the concept of what pillars. And
Like this might be like a necessary component he's referring to is like there's we just it's always a comparison to ourselves because it's hard not to do that, but we like maybe that's what's happening. Like when I look out from the scene, I can quickly tell like what's happening in the scene. Maybe that's something like like an unsupervised learning. No one's told me that there's like I'm not being supervised on this person, but like that's essentially how I represent the system, and as I interact with it, it's like consistent with my interaction. Other thoughts? Yeah, back.
So let's see. It seemed like he kind of made the argument that like we're going really, really fast, but like in the wrong direction. Like we're going really fast, but like straight to the brick wall. Like is that the case? Like what you see? Like these methods and tools that are being developed. I spoke in 2017, right? And now 2019. Right. So how much has changed? Like, has he changed his tone?
I don't know. So what's really interesting is that this mu0 paper just came out, and it actually is. So he made this criticism of DeepMind, pursuing artificial general intelligence through model-free reinforcement learning. However, mu0 is not model-free; it's model-based reinforcement learning. So like it's learning a model of the game rather than building heuristics of the game into the algorithm. So I would be interested to know what his thoughts are on that. But regardless of that, I think a lot of the arguments would still just I think he would still adhere to them, right? Which is this method of learning, which requires us to have huge amounts of data to train models that do excellent interpolation between data points within the data set or within the distribution, but do horribly as we extrapolate outside of it. It's just not anything like learning. It's not. It's not like the things it's learning to, like the representation. And what's the right way to say this? So the things that it's learning to do are very, very restricted to the data that it receives, and it needs a lot of that data just to do that much. And what the point that he keeps pointing, so he talks a lot about innateness, but it's like, we clearly have neural network-like things in our heads. I mean, neural networks are like the things in our heads, but we come like already kind of pre-able to do lots and lots of reasoning tasks and stuff. So like we don't, maybe the reason why we don't need to learn from millions of examples, maybe just a couple examples, because we have this innateness. But I think there's something deeper there too, which is just like we fundamentally don't learn via like back propagation, right? Like that is not what's happening here. We don't have an error. We don't have like we don't take a supervised. There's not a supervised model that like is continually comparing what the right answer is and calculating like the difference and the error that's made there, and then like changing our internal states because of that. We do more of we have like a fundamental understanding of physics, not to write the equations down, but just how physics basically is, like the physics of extended objects. I'm going to run with that if I walk towards it, that kind of thing. And that when I try to solve a problem, I don't solve it by like going through millions of examples. I can reason about how all the things go together in a very different way.
Of course, we maybe do it, but on very simple tests. Like if I learn how to shoot a basketball, right? Then I readjust with a loss. But on image recognition, definitely we're learning.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's a good example. But even there, right, we don't require, like, we don't learn by like taking a million different shots and then learning the statistics about what goes in or out. What we actually do is we take a few shots and we make slight adjustments if we are making those, right?
I suck at basketball, so I might use statistics, but yes.
Yeah, but we're doing something fundamentally very different. It's more like an exploration of the state space given the constraints of the physics rather than like learning all of the physics as part of taking the shots.
Yes.
So did you finish your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Or your question? All right, let's see. I think you had yours.
So like essentially he advocates on the complete like unsupervised learning. So like but without the guidelines or the criteria, like how does the unsupervised learning, is it in making progress? Like is it or like to unsupervised learning are we a little bit confused?
I don't think I quite understood your question. Let me just repeat that. Like, I don't think the point of this talk was to talk about like the role of unsupervised learning in artificial general intelligence. It was just that he was pointing out that like people like Jeff Hinton sort of had this back in 2017. This is updated now. Have this feeling that like most of what we've done, most of the success that we've had in applying machine learning to do these harder problems has been in supervised learning area, and that there strides have been made in the unsupervised learning area, but that's really more from like a generative point of view rather than like rather than just like a general like representation learning point of view. And I think that's all I really had to say about that. Like his statement was, unsupervised learning is probably a necessary part of like a general system, but he wasn't really. He was more arguing for, innateness as providing a lot of the representations that you might already get out of unsupervised learning. I don't know if I got a question. You can ask your finding. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. So he also talked in 2017, but then that was like right at the time when GANs were coming out, right?
No, GANs were going to do that. 2014 was the first paper.
Well, like the most success with GANs.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it was more successful in 2017, but they've been around for a while. And VAEs, you know, other types of unsupervised learning have been around much earlier than that. Yeah. Okay, a couple of hands. Yeah, John.
So is there any way to prove that deep learning can't learn these kinds of things? I mean, as you were talking about, obviously deep learning, this kind of thing is going to be part of the process of learning. But it seems to me like, I don't know, like for example, word vectors, they try to capture the essence of what a word is, right? Using certain types of features that it learns itself that we don't really understand. But it just seems to me like, I mean, this particular algorithm didn't necessarily learn what a pillar was, but you could, like, one machine learning algorithm could like learn what a pillar is and then what are some general properties about it. I don't know. It seems to me like expanding the way we represent data could also improve this a lot.
Yeah, so like you're coming down on like the Jan LeCun side of this, which is like, or I don't know, you're exploring the Jan LeCun side, which is like, if we have enough data, these things can learn. These things can learn. And maybe that's the case. Maybe we can get enough data and have enough compute to like learn, you know, the physics of the world and how to interact with it, and you know, do goal planning and all that kind of stuff like that. There's nothing really saying that no, we can't do that. Again, like his point is like probably the amounts of data that you need for that are huge, and even when you're done with that, you still will have this problem. It's still very likely to have this problem that when you move outside of that data set, like towards extrapolation, that these learning systems will completely fail. Because like it's just a characteristic of these models is that they're excellent at interpolating within the data set, but horrible at extrapolating. And so that's very different from how like we experience learning. Like we, like just in general, we're really good at going into completely like new environment. When I say new environment, I just mean like you know, the coloring of the environment. I mean like we go to a foreign country and nobody speaks the same language, and yet like we don't die. You know, like we don't run into pillars and things like that. We don't, you know, like we get around because like we do, you know, we're excellent at like metaphor and analogy, and like we see what, you know, we're able to recognize things that look different, but like, you know, we're really quickly like, oh, that's like this, and then all of a sudden we're now operating the system really quickly. It didn't take a million tries, right? It took like a couple of tries. I mean, we don't speak the language very well. A computer might be a lot better at learning a new language than we are, but like for most goals that correspond to like, I'll just say, this is just really coarse way to think about life, but keeping yourself alive, like it doesn't take that many, and it doesn't take that many chances like to learn, and you like extrapolate really, really, really well.
I mean, it's like kind of like we have a little bit of an innate sense of gravity and physics and stuff like that, how we move.
Yeah.
Like if you could represent data in such a way that you could represent the laws of physics and then kind of give it to the algorithm, kind of like say, oh, this is something that I always need to adhere to.
Right. I think that's like one of his main points, right? Is that we will probably see more success by putting more constraints into the systems, like innately into the systems, the learning system, than it does with neural networks or any other one.
Yeah.
Like that, like we should be doing that. So Jan LeCun's main argument is that we don't need to do that. We just need like great architectures and more data. And he's saying, no, what we really need is, you know, great architectures that are constrained by like the rules of the systems that we already live in.
I mean, I like totally agree. We should explore all areas of learning, but just like completely saying deep learning is not the way to get there. To me, it comes across as extreme.
Yeah, but 5 years ago you wouldn't have said that, you know. It just seems like it seems like it's the way because it's the only way that we have really available to us to see. Like it's the only, these are the only systems that really seem to learn anything interesting. But they are super brittle as soon as you move out of the data set. So it's just like, it's really just a change of kind of the magnitude of the effect rather than like a new fundamental way of learning that has existed in the past.
Oh, I think so. In unsupervised learning, though the samples has no labels, but it still, I think it still has the rules that we need to tell the machine learning because it's mentioned unsupervised learning to just to realize our innate ability that are born with us. So the innate ability is already the set rules in mind.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right.
I also think so.
I think you agree.
It mentions the unsupervised learning. It used the example of the plane going through the pillars.
But that wasn't unsupervised learning. That was reinforcement learning.
Reinforcement learning.
Yeah.
Because of the left picture, I remember it's a very successful one. So the successful one is not unsupervised learning.
No, that was all reinforcement learning. His whole point of that one was just to show that, like, as soon as you change the statistics of the data that the thing was trained in, the thing no longer does well because it didn't actually learn like what would be really useful for generalization, which is like this is the space that I can safely go through, and this is how I would get through it from where I am right now. Instead, it learned like, you know, this kind of coloration of pixels at this time in the game where I'm at means I got to turn left, or that I got to turn right. I hope you can see the difference here, because that's actually really important to this whole argument. Is that, like, that's very, very different from like saying I know what a pillar is, and like that it's spatially extended, and that if like I keep going in this direction, I'm going to run into it, and that's bad. And I don't have to do that because like right next to it is a space that if I go through it, I won't run into it, right? Like there's a real huge fundamental difference that's at the core of this argument. And so, yeah, it has really little to do with unsupervised learning. It's more to do with like the goal-based planning that we have right now in deep learning is reinforcement learning, right? Like, and the goal is reinforced by the reward, right? So like this is why RR plays such a big role in these arguments, is because it is like we all think of like intelligence as being able to kind of formulate goals, plans, and execute them. And like the closest thing we really have to that is reinforcement learning right now.
Yeah, so here's something kind of tangentially related that I'm thinking about. And I think the last time we had a discussion, kind of like the same questions came up, but kind of start with like an analogy, which is that, you know, in this class, you teach us to use a crescent wrench. It's a great tool, but the world's full of like Phillips, you know, like Phillips head or something like that. So, like, what kind of seems like it's happening, like to some extent, is that like it's really good at image recognition. You know, you're like, okay, great. Like, how does this apply to other things? Okay, great. It's also really ends up being like pretty good at like translating, or ends up being pretty good at these things. Basically, the things that you have on the left side. You know.
Yeah.
And then there's just like this wonder of like, how much does it apply to things outside of this? And then there's like two arguments. You could say that, well, maybe it doesn't apply to those things. Like maybe it doesn't apply to these other avenues. Or you could say that like, maybe it's applied to these other things because of a low-hanging fruit or for whatever reason, or there's more research being put into this, but you don't necessarily know that it won't apply to all these other different kind of avenues. And one argument that I think on the left is that he said was important, which I don't really know very much about, we don't talk about it here, but it's like advertising, right? And why was it successful for advertising? Was it successful for advertising because a lot of people put a lot of time into it and were able to find that it was successful, or was there something innate to advertising that made this a good candidate?
Yeah,
and I'm just kind of like,
yeah, I get where you're going with that. That's interesting. So, you know, like, he's sort of doing that tongue in cheek, first of all. Like, good at advertising means that Google makes whatever it is, like $30 billion a year, in revenues from advertising. That's what it means to be good at advertising. Is that actually good? It's hard to say if we're really good at it or not. I mean, are we better than another system for serving up ads? Probably, but I think the fundamental are we good at it or not is already a fuzzy question. And also it can be evaluated in pretty simplistic ways, right? Which is nothing I don't know, goal planning and execution, right? But your point is well taken. A lot of effort's gone into it because it generates money, and people get paid a lot of money to do it, right? So a lot of effort's been spent there. So you're if all that same effort could have been spent I don't know, doing something else, maybe as much progress would have been made there as well. But I would argue that the advertising thing is a bad thing. Plus, like you were saying, use the example of recommendation engines. They're great, but they still have I don't know, you had the example 2.5% error, right? That's fine for advertising. If you kind of miss the ads 2.5% of the time, they're wrong, or whatever that really means. But it's horrible if in another setting where autonomous vehicles, right? You can't be wrong about pedestrians 2.5% of the time. That is a fundamentally flawed system that will not we would not accept that to be we wouldn't pay money for that or whatever. So they're really different kinds of systems. So we might be really good at it, but we're really good because it funds all Google's activities. That's what it means to be good. It's not good in the sense of this thing. Yeah, well, this thing you put it out in the real world and it actually does something good and useful, and it generalizes.
But was there the expectation that a machine should never make a mistake on certain things? That's also one of the problems for a self-driving car. For example, if self-driving cars had a much lower incident rate than humans, people would still get angry at self-driving cars. So they wouldn't put more money in that. There is a lot of social issues also on the top.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think we would accept self-driving cars if the rate of accidents went down. Even if there were some, I think we would accept that. But the 2.5%.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I know this is a goofy example because he's not actually saying that we have the driverless system, but that's way higher than actual human error. Yeah. All right, time is well up. I'm totally happy to keep hang out and talk if you want to, but yeah, just wanted to kind of leave with that. Just kind of check on what it is we learned about this semester, and just realize this is an awesome tool belt. You will continue to get better and better and better. If you think this is exciting, hopefully you'll find some way to make it a career, and be part of the whole development of it. But just know that this is not this isn't we haven't solved it yet. We got a long ways to go, and but that also makes it exciting. So, anyways, thanks for a great semester, and good luck with the projects. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and I hope to see you around. Yeah. So typically this would be something like how do you able to learn representation with you learn it some way, you validated it. Does that make sense? That's typically how
I don't know, I always
It's like 10 by 10 now. What do you guys want to do? 10 by 20?
You took like a neural network. You just try both and see which one's better. Right? That's how this works. It's totally empirical.
Sorry, vice versa.
Yeah.
So basically just like learning to inference and then like.
Yeah, like you don't even have to code it. There's like libraries that have super optimized versions of it. So you don't have to do coding. You just use it. Scikit learn. How it's using Scikit learn? Yes. Yeah.
Anything like
Yeah, so it's not about DQ, it's about DQ.
Okay, so.
Which makes you think, what is there a place where?
Yeah, well, we did DQ, yeah, we did last week. DQ learning was last.
Massive.
Was last.
Or is there like, you want to use like
So it's at 3,000, like they back
4K, 4,000.
Yeah,
I mean, that's just the choice you make.
It's kind of so the
There's not a best.
Our
DQ
developers.
is all about when you
Give it a go.
try to learn structures.
There are not the structures that you want to learn.
You know, like if you think it's getting stuck in a local depends on the problem.
This is the kind of stuff.
There's not like a general actual stuff.
I wouldn't.
It's hard.
So like 106. So 106. Sorry, that's about 302.
Hey, yeah, the class is really good. Thanks for being here. It's fun to do.
Yeah.
Good luck with things.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. Your background, it's like 2 months.
Well, I did math, but I did. My dissertation was
You want to estimate deep learning using what it seems like
it's, I mean, yeah, it's great, but not like, but not like defining. It's, you know, it's just, you know, it gets its inspiration. It's not meant to be like,
Just go around and there is a big it's a big lab.
There are definitely a lot of like computational data scientists.
We have each of us have
Full models and like firing rate for like, so you have neurons that actually are like firing, right? They actually are accumulating potential and like soma and threshold, right?
Yeah.
There's some firing in there. There's a lot of different ways. Those models, like those things don't do anything. Like they're horrible. Like, like there was, I remember this has been a while, so I maybe there was a paper on someone had models. I can't think exactly what part of it was, but it was like. So it was like the most like neocortex or something like that. I was able to simulate like